remember is that once we're at the 18-month date, there are 3 reasons you can go to the 24-month date. Even if services are not given at the level that we think they should be. It's only if someone's recently released from jail and is making consistent progress in their counseling that they are, we will be discussing this later. There's 2 other reasons that they'll talk about. We're moving along. JL, I'm sorry, but JL is another one of those cases about making an appropriate plan. In this case, particular case, okay, the juvenile court declined to assert dependency jurisdiction, dismissed the petition. The Court of Appeal held that there was no reasonable basis for the trial court's dismissal of the petition under 300B, but it's important because in making a plan, mother had left the child with someone she knew to be an abuser. When you look at 366.22 subdivision B, one of the reasons for, or no reason for the parent makes a plan is in custody. If you just release to someone who you know can take care of the child, usually that's enough to avoid the subdivision and also the G and B. But in this case where you know that the person you're recommending the child to be released to is someone who's an abuser, not very nice, as in this case the child was sexually abused, but mom had a good suspicion that that would happen, that may affect the finding under subdivision G. So keep this case in mind when you're trying to say G doesn't apply because my client made plans. The plan seems to have to be someone placing with someone who can take care of the child. So thank you very much for my portion. Thank you.
Hi folks, I'm Brian. I'm in the Martello firm.
Hey, Brian.
All right.
Hey guys, good to see you. I'm going to talk about removal and disposition. In order to remove a disposition, the court's got to make 2 very specific findings. Does anybody remember what they are?
There.
Tell us, please.
No idea? Okay. The first is a substantial danger to the child's physical or emotional health. The second finding that the court needs to make is that there are no reasonable means to protect the child. And only in those, when the court can answer yes to both of those 2 elements, is removal appropriate. And the court needs to make a finding on both of those elements by clear and convincing evidence. So the 2 cases that I'm going to talk about deal with each one of those elements separately. So in Re AE, it's somewhat similar to the Gonzalez case that Steve talked about earlier. It dealt with a one-time incident of the father striking the child on the butt with a belt. What I would note about the facts of that case is it was sort of a ramp-up type of issue. It's not the sort of situation where the dad just started wailing on the kid right away. He basically said, after the kid was acting up, knock it off or I'm going to hit you, and the kid's response was to kick the dad. So I think it's a very narrow set of circumstances in that it's not the sort of situation that we encounter very frequently where we're talking about really severe physical abuse. We're really talking about somebody that was trying to discipline their kid, not somebody that was actually abusing their kid. But what the Court of Appeals ultimately ended up saying is that this incident, standing alone, did not satisfy that first element. That there was not a showing by clear and convincing evidence that this child was at risk, substantial risk, to their emotional or physical well-being. Basically what the court said is, without anything more, something indicating that this was going to reoccur in the future, that first element wasn't satisfied. The second case deals with the second element, and that is the whether or not there are reasonable services that could prevent detention. And the facts in this case are actually really, really bad, which is actually really, really good for us. Specifically, the mother in this case, the case came in because the child was beaten for stealing a wallet at church. The mother struck her in the head with an extension cord, also hit her in the face and arms. The social worker observed dark bruises under her eyes. The child said that mother often beats her with extension cords, belts, and clothes hangers. The child said that afterwards her head hurt, and she was bleeding from the top of her head. And she also had a swollen left eye. So the mom really did a number on this kid. Obviously the court sustained the petition, but the reason that the court reversed is because, and how many of you have had a case where under the section of the report, they're supposed to put it in there where it says, it talks about reasonable efforts. And all the report says is reasonable efforts were provided to prevent detention. I mean, that's literally all it says. It's usually, one sentence. And I think most of the time everybody goes, well, if you say so, okay. And what this case is saying is that that is not sufficient, that the social workers in their report must specifically talk about efforts, services that they've considered to prevent detention, why they don't think that they're going to work, and in addition to it being in the reports, the court needs to make factual findings on the record that these efforts were provided and that they're not going to prevent removal. So it has to occur both in the social worker's report, and the court needs to make specific findings. They essentially got on both the social worker and the court for giving a really conclusory, perfunctory analysis of reasonable efforts to prevent detention. The only thing that I would caution you guys against is don't read too much into what this case stands for. I don't think it stands for the notion that there are reasonable efforts to prevent detention in cases this bad. I don't think it goes that far. I think really what it is the Court of Appeals dinging the court and the department on just in a conclusory fashion asserting that there's no reasonable efforts. But I don't think it necessarily stands for the proposition that in a case this bad, there are always going to be services that can be put in place. And in fact, it was remanded just for the trial court to make the specific findings. That's it. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Harkness. I'm the writ attorney for the Martella firm. Hi, Rebecca. Brian writes writs as well. He failed to mention that, so he's on his second and third writ, I think now. I'm going to talk about B10 and 11. If you know me, you know I like to win cases. So B10 and 11 is an area where we win cases. We may not win at the trial level, but we have a fair amount of reversals. Probably one of our highest areas, we have reversals on B10 and 11. The reason for that is because usually the judge is misinterpreting what B10 and 11 really says. So
I'm sorry, Rebecca. Lancaster would like you to move over and get in the camera.
Yellow
Stand
box.
in the yellow box.
Yellow
The
box.
yellow brick road.
That's
Get on your mark.
Yeah. The box is scaring me. Okay. So there is a new case out literally just a few weeks ago. It's called NRE DH, and you should see that under the first bullet point. And it really explains what the judges need to be doing on B10 and 11. Basically, you have to look at what the original allegations were for when they lost their first set of kids. And you need to compare those allegations to your current sustained allegations. So in that case, the first set of the father's children, it was just basically a dirty home case. When he comes around the second time, it was drugs, anger management, and domestic violence. So what they were saying in that case is that we don't even really get to B10 and 11 and the reasonable efforts because B10 and 11 doesn't even apply. You've got two completely different sets of allegations going on here, and I think that's something that is missed a lot at the trial court. You don't even have to get to the reasonable efforts part of the analysis. It just doesn't apply. That case also goes into some of the, even though they said it doesn't apply, they went into some of the factors you need to look at in determining what is this reasonable efforts thing. They talk about the duration, extent, and context of efforts, and quality and quantity of efforts, and also degree of progress. Now, they do caution us that the degree of progress, it's just a factor. A lot of our judges basically use that as the only factor. That is wrong. They say quite clearly success alone is not the sole basis. So conceivably, you could have a client who's testing dirty, but if they're in a program and they're engaged and they're making good progress in their program and they're still in the game, that does not mean that they're automatically, that B10 automatically applies or B11. Now, in typical dependency fashion, in this particular case, the appellate court was fine with bypassing him under E1. So, I mean, that's how that goes. Cheryl P. is one of our older cases, but it does talk about that we're really focusing on efforts and not so much progress. So again, progress is just a factor. It's not the only factor. But you can't just, show up to one or two classes. So the KC case talks about lackadaisical or half-hearted efforts aren't enough. So there is sort of like a fine line there. Well, actually, let me just talk really quickly about an unpublished case, an unpublished writ that we took, and that was out of Trent Acosta's court. That was H.U. Tasinga's writ, so he won that. In that case, Trent Acosta basically used the wrong standard. He said that the mother's progress was cyclical in nature. In other words, she was bouncing in and out of her programs, and that she hadn't made substantial progress. So what you really want to be listening for when the judge is making the record is the judge inventing standards that aren't in B10 and 11? Because B10 and 11 is basically talking about reasonable efforts. It's not talking about substantial progress. It's not talking about whether the progress was cyclical. And so we won the writ on that. They flat out said Trent Acosta used the wrong standard. So really be listening for that. And on that case, I would also note that H.U. didn't call any witnesses on that case. You don't necessarily need to call a witness on B10 and 11 in order for us to take a writ on it. He had ample reports that had a MAT assessment in it about mothers bonding with the child. He had a bunch of statements from the social worker saying she is complying with some mental health treatment and drug testing. So he made an argument strictly on the reports. And in my opinion, that was a good call, because once we put this client on the witness stand, you're opening it up to all kinds of things. Just be confident in the record. If the record is good, and remember it is the department's burden on B10 and 11, if the record is good, just go with the record, make your argument based on the record. Lastly, if you do have a pen, the last bullet point, I would write 388 next to it. That's a little confusing, I'm sorry about that. Generally, the standard for B10 and 11 is going to be clear and convincing, but if you are at the point where the services have been terminated and then you're coming back with a 388 a month or two later, you don't have to meet that clear and convincing standard for best interest, which is really good for us. It's just going to be a preponderance. So that's a much easier standard to meet. Best interest is always going to be a factor for B10 and 11, so make sure you're not missing that at the trial level. A lot of your transcripts are talking about reasonable efforts, and that's great, but make sure you get to part 2, which is why this is in the best interest. In H.U.'s case, mom was visiting the kid every day. So we had the best interest. The appellate court didn't even comment on it because we basically had it. The visits went well. She was bonding with the child. It was a baby. So just look for things like that for the best interest. Okay. And now I'm going to pass it off to Melissa.
Hello, I'm Melissa Chayton. I'm the writ attorney with the Firth firm.
Bird.
Formerly with Martello firm. So I'm going to discuss some cases.
CLC.
Formerly with CLC.
County
Formerly with County Council.
Scandal
Formerly
everywhere.
Patel, formerly selling real estate.
You're like, Bob,
Still selling
Yes.
move
real estate.
around.
So I'm going to discuss some reasonable services cases. And we have one case out of this year that's really, really good, although it's very, again, it's very fact-driven. And it's in Ray Taylor J. It's in one of these slides. And in this case, the trial court had found reasonable services had been provided, and the Court of Appeal reversed the reasonable efforts finding. And again, this is a reversal out of 412 when Bornstein was sitting. But in that case, the court found that the social worker just provided 2 lists to the mother, I believe it was in that case. One list contained the name of only one domestic violence program. And then the second list was about 7 years old and had no referrals for any individual counseling, which is something that the mother was also ordered into. So even though the mother really wasn't all that proactive, really the facts regarding her efforts weren't all that good either. The court found that really everybody was to blame. The trial court for continuing to find reasonable services had been provided when really they weren't, and mom wasn't really doing anything. Mom was really to blame too, because she wasn't really complying all that well. But the court found that it stated, but foremost blame was with the department, because the department is charged by the legislature with providing reasonable reunification services. So again, you know, don't just cite it in every case. It really depends on your facts, but really look at what has been provided to the client, because sometimes, in fact, they're not provided with good lists, or they're 7 years old, or they're in areas where your client can't get to. So this is a good case to be citing to for that. The next slide, I'm going to start with Elizabeth R., even though it's the last case, because a lot of people just cite to that case frequently. And again, it's so specifically fact-driven. The facts of this case were really specific, where the mother was hospitalized for mental illness, and it really compromised her ability to participate. But when she was out, she was doing almost everything she needed to do. Plus, she was visiting at the time. So, in this case, the trial court found, as it often says, is like, my hands are tied, I can't do anything. And the court believed it had no authority to extend services. And the Court of Appeal basically said under 352, the court can exercise discretion to continue reunification services. And it was really based on 352 that provides what the court called an emergency escape valve in the rare cases where the best interests of the minors would be served. So it's better to really be citing to 352 as opposed to Elizabeth R. Because 352 is really the code section that contemplates there may be situations which will warrant a continuance of really any scheduled hearing. So relying more on 352 than Elizabeth R., depending upon your facts. In Earl L., the father was incarcerated basically during the pendency of the entire case. And at the 18-month date, the court found that reasonable services hadn't been provided to him, but there was no showing that he would have benefited from any additional FR, because he didn't do anything, and he was really riding the coattails of mom. So the court found that even though he hadn't been provided with reasonable services, a parent can not just sit back and refuse to participate, and then on the 11th hour demand an extension of FR. So you've got to have a client that's doing something, making efforts. And in Tracy J., it's actually a really good case, but again, remember, it's also very fact-driven. These were both developmentally delayed parents, but they were doing everything. They were really cooperative. And the department in that case, it was the agency, I think it was maybe Orange County. The agency limited their visits just because of their disabilities, and really in the absence of any evidence showing that the parents' behavior jeopardized the children's safety. And the court found that that was not those were not reasonable services by foreclosing them, giving them for foreclosing them and giving them an opportunity to show that they could visit